In today's Locked On Pelicans, I'm going to tell you why Brandon Ingram is not going to be traded to the Sacramento Kings. We'll also determine if rebounding was actually bad in preseason. The numbers are going to surprise you. And we have a Trey Murphy extension update. It's a Friday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Friday episode. The season starts next week, and I'm excited. We've got a lot to cover. We're going to talk about Brandon Ingram not being traded to the Sacramento Kings. The rebounding in preseason is more mixed than you realize. It might not actually be a problem this season. Still might. And then we'll talk a little bit about Trey Murphy extension update and what I expect the number to come in as. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube. Season starts next week. Great time to start listening. So whether you are a new listener who's excited or you've been with me for a while, I appreciate you making Locked On Pelicans part of your day on this Friday. So let's get into the big news. And this was something that a lot of people asked me recently and had me actually genuinely confused as to why. And then it started to make a little bit more sense. So we've got to rewind a little bit here because we're going to look at Brandon Ingram and the Sacramento Kings. He was rumored to maybe go there over the summer, a trade. Maybe the Kings were interested in adding Brandon Ingram to that roster. Obviously, a deal didn't get done, and they ended up going and signing DeMar DeRozan in a sign and trade with the Chicago Bulls. That was kind of the Kings' big offseason move. But then this week, they made an interesting move. The Kings traded forward Jalen McDaniels to the San Antonio Spurs, basically what was just like a salary dump of a player to clear a roster spot. So now all of a sudden the Sacramento Kings have an open spot and you see the same kind of rumors crop back up again. Could Brandon Ingram be going there? They cleared a roster spot. Could it be Zach LaVine going to the Sacramento Kings? It's going to be neither of those guys. So we can throw cold water on this because the day after that move, when they traded Jalen McDaniels to the Spurs, they went and signed Doug McDermott. So they filled that last roster spot with a guy now that you can't trade for 3 months. So that kind of rules this out. The other thing is just teams keeping an open roster spot is actually kind of normal. The Pelicans have an open roster spot right now. You're seeing a lot of teams not fill that 15th spot for a variety of different reasons. Some of it's money, some of it's flexibility, but it doesn't guarantee that a trade or anything like that is going to go down. The other thing to kind of factor into this too is, does a team with De'Aaron Fox, Domantas Sabonis, those two work, DeMar DeRozan and Brandon Ingram make much sense? DeRozan and Ingram are similar-ish players, mid-range artists. Would they be able to coexist? We're already wondering about the fit with DeMar DeRozan on that Sacramento Kings team. If you put in a similar player to him in Brandon Ingram, better passer than DeRozan is, does that really make, a ton of sense? And I think the answer to that is no. The other thing to factor into this too is, if the Kings wanted Ingram, they would have just made a move for him this offseason. They would have done it instead of signing DeMar DeRozan. You can argue which player is better, DeRozan or Ingram, and I think DeRozan fans are going to say him. Ingram fans are going to say him. But if they wanted Ingram, they could have gotten him. And we don't think the asking price for Brandon Ingram is going to be insanely high. It wasn't going to take a guy like De'Aaron Fox to get him, nor Sabonis. You might have tried to get Keegan Murray in that deal, but that doesn't seem like it was going to happen. And so nothing went down essentially. So I don't see this move that the Kings did as a precursor. I didn't at the moment see it as a precursor to a Brandon Ingram deal, and I certainly don't see it after that Doug McDermott signing for them. I think an Ingram trade, if it happens, is going to be later in the season, and that's if it happens. I think Ingram can come out and play really well this season for New Orleans, and if you're an everydayer or a longtime listener, the way he gets paid the most money is by New Orleans. I'm going to hammer this point home. If he changes his shot profile and plays better than he did last season and fits in more with this team, and he's the second or even third best player on the Pelicans this year, they're not going to just let him walk for nothing, because that likely means the Pelicans had a really good season and they'll overpay to have another really good season next year. So if Ingram wants that bag, it's by fitting in on this team more. You can see the consensus around the league has kind of been, we don't value him a ton. Otherwise, a team would have traded for him. It would have happened at this point in time. So if he wants that big time deal, it's going to be here in New Orleans, but he's going to need to fit in. Now, I went back and rewatched all of his possessions against the Houston Rockets on, Tuesday night. And he played better than I initially thought. Going back and looking at what he was trying to do, he was ready to shoot threes and trying to get into those spots early, running to the corners, trying to catch passes. His first shot attempt was that made three off of running to a corner. You see him doing that more. So I want to give him more credit than I did the other day, because his play, while not ideal, and part of it was like, oh yeah, that's Brandon Ingram, was still probably, if he plays like that, that's going to lead to a better season than he had last year and him fitting in more with this team. So I'm still very optimistic that he can be here for the long term and play really well. It's going to take threes. It's going to take getting to the rim. It's going to cut down on like just him kind of dribbling the air out of the ball and then taking up a contested mid-range jumper. But he definitely actually showed some better signs of progress than I initially thought when I went back and rewatched that game. And that encourages me for the start of the season. So I think he's going to be in prove-it mode, not just for the Pelicans, but every NBA team this season. So I do think if he comes out and plays well, he could either get moved for a team that gets desperate, or the desperate team is more likely going to be the Pelicans than not. And I think that's how he plays himself into a big contract. If he comes out and is the Brandon Ingram from last year fully, he's going to earn a mid-level exception deal next year because there's no cap space and teams still don't want to trade for him. That's the big risk there. So if he wants the bag, it's fit him better on New Orleans, make it work with Zion Williamson at a high level, and things will be really good. And he'll get paid. He definitely will get paid. There's another Pelicans player that's going to get paid. That's Trey Murphy. We'll talk about that in the third segment of today's show. But next, I want to look at the rebounding. Was that actually a concern in preseason? Some of y'all are going to say yes. Numbers in a rewatch of every first half, and I'll tell you why we only looked at that. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Looking at the first half is going to tell a better story. That's coming up here next. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Hims. Your sex life is important, but your schedule is busy. You don't have time to go to a doctor's office to get treated for ED. Through Hims, you can get personalized ED treatment without stepping foot outside your door. Hims is changing men's healthcare by providing you access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. And Hims provides access to a range of doctor-trusted ED treatments like chewable hard mints and Viagra and Cialis and their generics for up to 95% cheaper. Process is 100% online, so there's no need for an uncomfortable doctor's visit. And all you do is answer a series of questions on their site, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment options. If prescribed, your medication ships directly to you in discreet packaging for free. No insurance is needed. One low price covers everything from treatments to ongoing care, and they have hundreds of thousands of trusted subscribers. Hims can help you find the ED option that works for you. So start your free online visit today at hims.com/lockedon. That's HIMS.com/lockedon for your personalized ED treatment options. hims.com/lockedon. The products mentioned are chewable compound products which are not approved by or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website for details and important safety information. Subscription required. Price varies based on product and subscription plan. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube as well. We are, again, the #1 Pelicans podcast for a reason here. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. I appreciate y'all. What are you most excited about for the start of the season? And now for your second listen, the Locked On NBA preview shows. Right now, from East and West contenders to potential tanking teams, a 6-episode series with everything you need to know about the NBA season. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So let's get into some X's and O's and some stats here around an area that we're concerned about with the Pelicans, and that's going to be defensive rebounding. We're not overly worried about offensive rebounding, but we're worried about defensive rebounding given that the centers are a little bit lackluster on the roster, and that the team is planning on playing pretty small. The expected opening night lineup is very tiny with Herb Jones, Zion Williamson as your front court players. You have Brandon Ingram, you have DeJounte Murray, you have CJ McCollum. There's some good height there too. But you're lacking that 7-footer, the guy to just hoover up rebounds and end and terminate opponents' possessions. So is rebounding actually an issue? The team was a good rebounding team last year. They finished 6th best when it came to defensive rebounding last season. The numbers were good there. And it wasn't all Jonas Valanciunas. He didn't really play much in the second half of games. So as that number is reflective of the whole season, it's not just him doing that work, though he was a very good defensive rebounder. So I wanted to go back in the preseason, and I rewatched every first half, and I have some of the numbers here of, were they a good or bad rebounding team? That is a very valid question to ask. I don't think it's as cut as dry as saying they were bad. You can look at the box score and you can see the raw rebounding numbers, but that does not always really tell you the story when it comes to teams. You need to look beyond just those numbers. Pace is a factor and other things like that. If a team misses a lot of shots, you're going to have more rebounding opportunities. So when I look at this, I'm not necessarily looking for just those numbers. Oh, they were out rebounded. That's lazy analysis, truthfully. What I'm looking at is defensive rebounding percentage and how does that kind of equate to what the Pelicans did. So I'm going to pull up the NBA.com numbers to keep this even. Numbers kind of vary depending on where you go. The Pelicans during the regular season last year were the 8th best defensive rebounding team. They had a defensive rebounding percentage of 72.5. The Sacramento Kings led the way at 74.2. So they were in that range, about 2%. So they're kind of right in there when it comes to being an elite defensive rebounding team. Again, not all Jonas Valanciunas. So what we're trying to see is, where do they rank in terms of defensive rebounding percentage off of that number? Let's use that as kind of the index number there. And I, in these 3 preseason games, only want to look at the first half of games. I don't care about the second half. I don't care about the fourth quarters or anything like that. They were playing scrubs. They're playing guys who are no longer on the roster for the most part. You weren't seeing them as a team go out and do it. Those numbers from the fourth quarter are meaningless to me for trying to predict if that matters for this team or not. So let's just look at the defensive rebounding percentage in the first half of games when the starters were playing for the most part. Now, there were some funky lineups and testing of things out, and we didn't get to see the starters in there for one group at all, so that could change things. But let's go off of what we have. Is rebounding actually an issue here? In the first half against the Orlando Magic, they had an 87.5% defensive rebounding rate. Now, obviously, it's not going to be that good in the regular season against any team. That number is a little bit, that's why kind of looking at it on a 1-game sample size here is a little funky. But 87.5 is what the starters, for the most part, did against a very tall, big, strong Orlando Magic team. I don't know, that seems pretty good. Now, in the second game, things dipped. 64% was their defensive rebounding rate in the first half against the Miami Heat. Now, in both those games, they had Zion Williamson, but they did not have Brandon Ingram, but they were starting Daniel Tice, who I don't think anyone is going to call a rebounder. Now, people aren't calling Zion or Ingram a rebounder either, so take for that what you will. And then in the third game against the Houston Rockets in the first half, when they were down 14. They had a 76% defensive rebounding rate. So 2 of the games were well above what they did last year, and 1 was well below. What this says to me as of now is I don't necessarily think defensive rebounding is going to be a problem. If you did it in the first half against the Orlando Magic, if you did it in the first half against the Rockets, that seems pretty good. Maybe Miami is just a bad matchup. Maybe it was an off night. Maybe the first half against the Rockets and Orlando is the outliers. Who knows? But that doesn't scream that they were getting slaughtered on the boards over the course of those halves. There are times when it's a disadvantage. There's times when they were team rebounding and it was fine. So overall, I don't know if this is going to be a massive issue. The big asterisk on this, right, is, well, we don't know when it comes to the starting lineup. And one of the things I've hammered for the everydayers, and if you're new to the show, this is something we're really going to be evaluating all season long, is how will the starters play? They were not great for the Pelicans last year. Y'all are probably tired of me saying this, but it's that important of a point. So if the starters struggle when it comes to defensive rebounding, they're going to need to make a change. Unless you're compensating for it. More on that in a second here. But based off of what we've seen and what we have to evaluate, it looks okay. Would I call it elite? Not necessarily. Is it bad? No, I don't think so. And overall, it leads to some things being kind of good. If you kind of take the middle number here, it's at 76%. We're not going to take the 87.5 and expect that. I'm not expecting 64% either, right? Like that number is just so horrifically low. That would have been by far the worst last season, and I just don't see that being the case for New Orleans. So I do think they're going to be kind of right in the mix here when it comes to rebounding. Will they be a top 10 unit? I think they can be close to that if they're not going to be in there. So I'm not necessarily sure based on what we've seen that defensive rebounding is going to be this massive disadvantage. Now it could. With the starters, we don't know. We're going to find that out on opening night. We're going to learn over that first week of the season where those starters are when it comes to defensive rebounding. Could be good, could be bad. Don't love the uncertainty when it comes to that sort of thing, but that's where we are right now. If it's bad, make a change. If it's not, that's okay. We just do not know right now. But say it's bad for the starters. This is where you've got to make up for it in other areas. You can have a bad defensive rebounding lineup. That's okay. And you can still win your minutes doing that. You've got to blow out the opponent in other areas. You got to do it offensively in particular, or also just force a lot of steals. They're going to force a lot of steals. We know that. But if they can get it going on the offensive end, it'll be okay. If they're unstoppable, unguardable, because they're small, they're fast, they're shooting, they're scoring, they're going to be in a really good position, I think, and losing the rebounding battle will be fine. One of the things we've talked a lot about on the show, and others have too, is that Warriors death lineup that played small with Draymond Green at center, first with Harrison Barnes, then with Kevin Durant. That lineup was not a good defensive rebounding lineup at all. They were in the 60s when it came to defensive rebounding percentage. They would have basically ranked like dead last in the league. And that lineup crushed it because you made up for it in other areas. If you can do that, you don't necessarily need to have an elite defensive rebounding unit out there. But given that some of the bigs in Daniel Tice and, Misi showed some potential there, are all a little bit untested. Maybe it means you go to a guy like Trey Murphy, who's just at least a big body and can shove dudes out of the way, even if he's not an elite rebounder. I've said keep an eye on him all off season. We'll find out on opening night. Carlo, it looks like, is not really going to be in the mix. I think he's going to be in Birmingham. He's been glued to the bench, not even playing in the second half. I think that kind of tells you where Willie Green views him right now. I would expect him to go down to Birmingham and get a bunch of minutes that way, and maybe get brought up in an emergency, or if someone like Daniel Tice is struggling, maybe he just gets benched and you need Carlo there. But I think they probably have Trey Murphy over him right now. The bigs probably go Daniel Tice, Misi, Trey Murphy, then Carlo. But you also don't need these guys a ton if you're going to play small. It's limited minutes. It's why in yesterday's show, if you listen to that one, you should. Nick Richards makes a ton of sense to me for a guy that can kind of come in off the bench, give you that rebounding and what you need, and be a cheap, actually attainable option for New Orleans that you can make a deal, get a deal done like tomorrow on, and hopefully the Pelicans will. We'll see. But overall, I think rewatching some of this and looking at some of the numbers and the data here, I'm less worried about rebounding than a lot of other people are, than some of y'all are. But that's also based on preseason and what we've seen. And we haven't seen what the starting lineup will do. That could be a problem for the starters. Right now, it doesn't appear so, though. But we're not going to see any of those starting lineups that they used get used on Wednesday. So we're going to find out. Something that we will definitely be watching regularly here on Locked On Pelicans and keeping track of. So coming up next, we talked about getting paid earlier. Trey Murphy's going to get paid. Let's talk about that. I'll tell you what I expect and when we think a deal will get done. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NBA fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you're going to get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Look, you want to win some money? Bet against the Saints based on that Thursday night debacle against the Denver Broncos. Go throw it down right now, and I would even just do the money line on the Saints to lose. You're going to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you do that. Or you can get in on the Pelicans opening night line of -7.5 against the Chicago Bulls. And all you have to do is go to FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook, to get started. Place your first $5 bet, and you're going to get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. Right now, you should be an everydayer of Locked On Saints. Ross Jackson is going to be breaking everything down about the black and gold. I was texting him throughout the game, being like, are we getting Dennis Allen fired? Is that what the show's going to be? You should listen to find out what he thinks. He told me what he thought in text, but go listen to Locked On Saints. Make them your second listen today to find out what they should do when it comes to Dennis Allen and everything with the black and gold. Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's wrap up today's show talking about Trey Murphy. Monday, the 21st, is the extension deadline. I think a deal with Trey Murphy will get done before that, and everyone is going to be happy about this. Trey is a very valuable player to this team. When you look at the way that he plays and what he does, this is someone that would be coveted around the NBA. He would fit on every team, and every team wants a guy like this, even after he signs his extension. And I do think he was going to sign an extension, and I think this would be very smart business for the New Orleans Pelicans. I'm very high on Trey Murphy. A lot of others are. There's still he needs to prove it. He needs to prove the defense, I think. The rebounding needs to be a little bit more consistent, but the shooting is there. The offensive game is there, and as the season went on last year, you even saw him add in a bit of an in-between game. Needs to get a slight better handle, another move or two there, because that's the one area of his game that I want him to work on more than the in-between mid-range jumper pull-up game is. When someone steps in his way when he's attacking the basket off, say, a strong closeout, he doesn't really know what to do then. Get a move, get around those guys, score at the rim a little bit easier than just trying to yam on people and kind of missing dunks at times. So I think he's going to get his extension. This shouldn't be a problem. These things always get done at the deadline. And so whether it's over the weekend or on Monday, we'll hear some news about that. We'll talk more about whatever the number ends up being. It's likely going to be for 5 years. It's not going to be the max that he can earn. And I think you look at two previous numbers here that make a ton of sense. There was, I'm completely blanking, Vassell on the, Devin Vassell on the San Antonio Spurs got a 5-year, what is that number? 5-year 146. Jaden McDaniels last year with the Timberwolves got 5 years, 136. Trey should slot in somewhere between that, between 136 and 146. I think 146 might be a little bit high. So if we're looking at this, 5 years, $140 million, somewhere in that range makes sense. That's about $28 million per year. Maybe it drops a little bit to $25 million per year on the lower end. That is a great deal for New Orleans. And now that might seem like a lot of money if you're skeptical about Trey, for someone who has not been a full-time starter, though he started plenty of games for New Orleans because of all the injuries. But he has had injuries himself. He missed the start of last season with the meniscus. He's missing the start of this season with the hamstring. This is someone who per game has not even averaged over 15 points per game. But he is an elite shooter. Last year, he took 7.8 three-point attempts per game, made him at 38%. The year before that, 40%. For his career, it's 39.2%. Those are really good numbers, especially on that volume with the size that he has too. And those deep threes are really tough for opponents to defend and really change the geometry of the court, the dimensions of the court, which opens things up for Zion Williamson even more. And you've heard me say this before. Zion Williamson, if you look at him and one other player, so two-man units, the highest net rating was him and Trey Murphy on the court. There's just something there. So signing Trey to say $25 to $28 million per year makes a ton of sense. And then when you think about the rising salary cap, and it's going up 10% every year. They've done some cap smoothing, so you won't see these massive spikes. But you're signing him to below a max deal. He's going to have outperformed that contract pretty quickly, I think, in my opinion. He's going to be earning $25 million when you're going to see max deals kicking in at $50, $60, $70 million. Now, he's not been in the NBA that long to earn some of those extremely large contracts. That's usually your third one in the NBA when you become eligible for that insane kind of money. But when the salary cap's rising and you're going to see some of these guys that he's better than getting paid more than him, this is going to look like a steal of a contract. You can keep him, build around Zion. You can keep him, build around Ingram. You can do whatever you want, and he's going to be a perfect second, third, fourth guy on a team one day. He's not there yet, but he will be. His ceiling is very, very high. This deal should get done. I would be beyond shocked, based on what I've been told, that it wouldn't. I think we'll get some news this weekend or on Monday. I think that's a great way to start the season with a real positive signing like that for this team. Trey likes being here. He wants to be here, likes the chemistry on the team. He put in a lot of work from talking with him this offseason about what he was planning on doing, working with Jason Tatum's trainer and others. I'm expecting a big year when he comes back healthy. I think you're going to see him play very well alongside Zion Williamson. That contract's going to be great for New Orleans in the future. He's going to be one of the most coveted guys in the league in a couple of years. Truly think that. And I think we'll see a deal done by Monday at the latest, and we can celebrate a little bit and not have to stress about all of this. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans, this week of Locked On Pelicans. I appreciate y'all so much for listening. NBA season starts next week. It's going to be a bit of a hectic week for me, but we're still going to have shows out. You'll see. And it's going to be a lot of fun. I can't wait. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to the Locked On Pelicans podcast and on YouTube as well. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all on Monday.